Thank you, Carol. Really appreciate you hosting me, and it's great to be in the Skyscraper Museum and see friends and colleagues and people from Hong Kong. Yeah, thank you for coming. I'm very excited to share this with you. So I'm an architect and urban designer. I'm very interested in urban form, the ways in which it comes to be and how a certain form becomes dominant, but also the way in which it structures our lives. I lived in Hong Kong for 3 years, and I recognized an urban form that I had not come across yet, and that's what I'm going to talk about. I will argue that the mall is somewhat central in this urban type. So I was very interested in finding this, and then, as Carol said, I put together a team of researchers and put this volume together and studied what I call the mall city. So to give you a bit of context, so I moved to Hong Kong about 7 years ago. At that time I was living in the United States. And here all the talk about malls is that they're dead, right? Malls, they're talking about dead malls, even of ghost boxes. These are so-called malls that have been abandoned, big boxes that are completely derelict. And they're being explained through a variety of reasons. One of them is how people are moving to the cities, but also with the advent of online retail. No one knows exactly how many, but the estimate is that there's thousands of these ghost boxes around. They're being adapted into new types of structures, even churches, offices, or some are literally left to decay. So to my surprise, when I moved to Hong Kong, I found that there was almost a mall on every single block. And we started to count the number of malls. There's 312 malls in a city like Hong Kong. It also has a lot of leasable retail space. In fact, it has the most amount of leasable retail space per land area in the world, only trailed by Singapore, that other city-state. So this went against this narrative of the dead mall. A lot of them are in Hong Kong Island, so to give you a bit of geography, this is Hong Kong Island. So a lot of them are on the north side, which is heavily urbanized, but also on the south tip of Kowloon. This is the peninsula that connects with China. So there's a lot of them here. And then you'll find that the larger ones, the so-called super regional malls, are on top of big railway stations. And you'll soon find out why. What's also interesting about Hong Kong is that the mall takes a very different form. Whereas in the United States, they're typically 1, 2, maybe 3 stories at best. You have a phenomenon of the vertical mall rising easily 10 stories, sometimes even 26 stories. So I Square, for instance, is a mall skyscraper that's entirely retail over many, many floors. And then there's a so-called podium mall. Also happens here, but in Hong Kong it's very, very common. So what is a podium mall? It's pretty much a base of a building, or in technical terms called podium, that is mixed use or retail. And on top of that podium or mall, all these towers gets built. So this podium mall is very, very common in Hong Kong. And this is a development called Union Square. It's built right on top of a train station. So here you see the floors exploded. So this, in the middle we have the mall, the mixed-use podium. And underneath we have the local rail or the regular metro system. And right below that there's a regional rail, so you can hop into the train and go to the airport. And on top of that there's a number of skyscrapers, including residential offices, but also hotel. And just for residential alone, it houses approximately 30,000 residents into one single structure. If you compare that, that's roughly the population of the whole of the West Village crammed into a single building on an area that's about 8 times as small as the West Village. So these are hyper-dense projects. Now, ironically, this vision of the mall, in which it's part of a larger mixed-use development, lies much closer to the vision of the inventor of the mall, the father of the mall, Victor Grun, who was an Austrian immigrant and moved to the United States. And actually, I'm very happy that Gary Hack is here, who used to work with Victor Grun. He's a colleague from University of Pennsylvania. But he initially thought of the mall as something that would counteract the isolation that was occurring at the time in American suburbia. So he moved to the United States as a European. He did not like kind of how suburbs were changing the daily lives of people, and he thought that a dense commercial center like a mall could ignite other forms of community. And he planned the mall actually as a center with medical offices, libraries, offices, and a lot of community functions. So sadly, this never happened. And it's almost like a Frankenstein's monster. This mall turned out to fuel the whole suburbia he was trying to counteract. So this is some quotes from his speech and also article on the sad story of shopping centers. Fast buck promoters and speculators perverted his vision of more than just selling machines. There was a tragic downgrading of quality. And then finally, I refused to pay alimony for those bastards' developments. So he ultimately moved back to Austria, to Vienna, only to find a mall outside of Vienna, migrating from the United States. So in Asia, there's been a very peculiar hybrid of the mall, and it came together with this other vision that has haunted a lot of cities, particularly in Asia, and that is Plan Voisin, or by Le Corbusier, the towers in the park. This was a plan for Paris that was never built, but the idea of having a very large tower set back from another with highways in between is a vision that is very influential. So what we see is that Hong Kong has somewhat hybridized the big box and the high-rise, and they made it to become this very peculiar form. You can also describe it as, where this model, Plan Voisin, with towers in the park, in the case of Hong Kong, becomes towers on the model. Think about New York meets Houston in Hong Kong, right? The mall and the skyscraper in one single place. And why does this work so well in the case of Hong Kong? Well, the mall itself provides buildings with extended entry points and elevated base. Towers are very efficient in housing many people in a small plot of land. So what the mall and the tower together, it establishes this ecosystem of efficiently housing a lot of people and effectively feeding the mall right below. So how did they come to be? So if you look at the history, the type is getting bigger and bigger and more complex, and more uses are being integrated. At first it was just residential, now it's also a hotel, offices, and they become these miniature cities. In 1976, there was a very important planning mechanism that was passed. It allowed for the streamlining of high-density, mixed-use and transit-oriented developments. And even more important, that year before that, the government set up the government-owned Mass Transit Railway Corporation, the MTRC. Now, what is the MTRC and what is so special about it? It's a transit authority. It builds railways, and subway stops, but it's also a real estate developer. So what's the point here? Well, it can actually capitalize on the value it creates. So whenever there's a transit station that's being built, because of the new value of the land, because of this transit connection, this authority can capture that value and build real estate on top of that. And in fact, if you look at the revenue or the revenue model, only 20% of the MTRC's profit is derived from transit operations. The vast majority comes from renting out the space that it builds. Not only that, it allows for a seamless integration between the transit and the development on top. In other cities, you have different parties that need to communicate and talk to each other, different designers. It makes it really complicated to have a kind of seamless integration between when you get out of the metro into the building. In Hong Kong, this is very normal and very well done. And this also explains why Hong Kong perhaps represents the best transit-oriented development city in the world. So more than 90% of all motorized trips in Hong Kong are by public transit. And that is because these subway stops are completely integrated in the buildings. So this is as good as it gets in terms of transit-oriented development. And there's a lot of innovations that the MTR provides. And if you compare the Hong Kong subway for the Hong Kong people here to the New York subway, it's sort of like a very different experience. But in Hong Kong, there's Wi-Fi, air conditioning, but there's also these automated glass doors, so no one falls onto the tracks. Then there's numbered doors. So when you're trying to meet your friends, you can say, okay, I'm going to meet you at door number 5. So it's a very efficient system. You can even check in your luggage in some of these MTR stops. So in the IFC, International Finance Center, you get off the metro, which is in the middle of the city. You can chuck in, if you're taking a flight, you can drop off your luggage right there. You can go shop in the mall above, and then later go to the airport without having to carry your luggage.
In 17 minutes.
In 17 minutes, that's right. So it's super connected, right? So there's people that live above there, and I've actually stayed in some of those projects, and you can be from your home door to door to the airport in 20 minutes, no problem. Because of the kind of density of malls and the multiple levels, there's been a lot of innovations in terms of mall design. And one very interesting innovation comes from the late architect John Jurdy is the so-called expresscalator, which is an escalator that goes up multiple stories in one shot. And some of these go up 4 or 5 stories under a minute, which is very fast and it's very important to do this because the hardest thing for retail designers is to get people up to multiple levels. Shoppers are not inclined to go up, so how do you move them to different stories? And the technical term in mall design is, how do you irrigate the mall with a kind of incessant flow of pedestrian traffic? Because retail rent is highly dependent on the number of eyeballs on storefronts. Langham Place has many of these expresscalators. Also has this stunning 8-story tall atrium. It's one of the tallest malls. It's about 15, 16 stories. And here you can see how the designers managed to irrigate all these stories through these very long escalators, these expresscalators that shoot up. So within 2 minutes, You can be from the central level all the way to the top. And not only that, designers have invented and designed really beautiful and stunning atriums. So here, Alignment Place has an atrium that's about 12 stories tall. And here you can see these escalators go through that. Now, what's the role of the atrium? When you're inside the structure for a long time, people tend to feel confined. Atriums and grandiose spaces provide somewhat of a mental restart. So that was the purpose of this atrium. So as people go in and they experience this vast atrium, they're energized and they'll be more likely to keep exploring what else is inside the structure. We've also seen a lot of interesting shaped atriums. Some of the atriums are oval shaped and beehive shaped, and this again a project from the hands of John Jordy. It's a beautiful oval shape that cuts through multiple levels. And here you see the section of this building. So it's all these different types of atriums and cuts through the building that will hopefully make it more easy for people to go and explore the structure and irrigate them all from top to bottom. So this is a very exciting section from an architect's point of view. And when I saw this section for the first time, it made me think of this Nolly map of Rome. When in the 18th century, Nolly, he thought a regular map doesn't really explain Rome. When you draw a regular map, just the streets, there's something that's missing because there's all these kind of private buildings or sometimes public buildings that have these interior spaces, like for instance the Pantheon, which is publicly accessible. They should also be part of the city fabric. The same for Hong Kong. If you would just look at a regular map of Hong Kong, you wouldn't see all these atriums inside. You would have no kind of idea that these exist, but they're very much part of public life. But whereas for Rome, maybe the Nolly map was more relevant, for Hong Kong we need a Nolly section because it's such a three-dimensional and vertical city. What's fascinating also is how the concept of the ground is obfuscated in Hong Kong. So because of these large podium malls, you effectively create a second ground on top of the roof of the mall. Becomes this whole other ground that people use for recreational purposes. Sometimes there's restaurants on there. So here we're actually like 5 stories above ground level, but you almost think that this is the ground floor. But there's also downsides to these type of projects. And they're so large that very often they encompass multiple city blocks. So they actually, as they are built, they consume some public space. And the developer, as a way to compensate for this, they're then required by the government to create public open space that's privately managed but accessible to the public. But very often these POPs, as they're called, are meant for people to get to shop. Because for instance here, in the case of IFC, it's placed on the roof. It's very hard to see. You have no idea that it exists. The only way to get to this public space is that you have to go through all these levels of the mall. So what it very often does is that it sets in stone a culture of consumerism. So the mall is placed deliberately on the intersection of all flows between offices, metro stops, residents, etc. So it becomes inevitable to visit the mall. At the same time, a lot of the roofs are actually far from exciting places. They're just places where people pass through. Partly this is because the government doesn't allow on a lot of the areas commercial use, so actually it would be better to make them more commercial, because by government regulation now they can only be these transitory places, these places to walk through. And then perhaps the biggest offense is very often the bleak exterior. So this is the outside of Union Square. It's like an 8-story tall windowless wall, right? This is hardly the most exciting place to be. If you look at the floor plan, you can already see what's happening because it's such a large structure. It has a lot of infrastructure, parking, mechanical systems. All of these are placed on the perimeter, leaving this blank hole on the outside. And then what's really designed then from a pedestrian perspective is this interior. And there's a lot of thought that goes into them. There's atriums in certain places that pull people through. Notice also how the corridors are deliberately kind of curvilinear and they're meandering. That is to create a sense of anticipation. These curvilinear streets, if this would all be completely straight, it would have had all the charm of a hospital or a prison building. So there's a lot of thought that goes into designing the interior, but the exterior is to be left bare. Some people also call this the Groen effect, which is named after Victor Groen, but I'm sure you wouldn't be pleased to find out that they named this after him, because what it stands for, it's meant to. Some people think that that these malls are deliberately designed to disorient people, so that they deviate from their purpose. Let's say you're going through the mall just to hang out, but then you get lost somehow, and you end up buying a whole new wardrobe. This is the Groen effect in place. But there's certainly research that supports this, at least in the United States. The more time people spend in malls, the more they're inclined to spend. So this research has supported the so-called mega malls and these entertainment malls. They're all malls that don't just provide retail, but also provide entertainment, almost sometimes entire theme parks. But maybe people in Hong Kong are somewhat resilient when it comes to the Groen effect, because a lot of people actually go to the mall to hang out. And we interviewed some of these. This was an interview from Mr. and Mrs. Chung, who are like retired seniors. We usually come here on Sundays. It is easy for us to spend a few hours here. This mall is a great place to get away from the heat. The restaurants are expensive, so we sometimes bring our own food. So it's very typical on Sunday for people to go there and spend some time. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're spending money. There's also a very bizarre form of community development that happens, particularly in the 1980s when they first started to introduce malls in Hong Kong. So in Newtown Plaza, which was a new residential estate that was built then, it was built around a shopping mall. And the mall owner, in order to get the locals familiar with the mall and to get them to shop, they actually provided a lot of community events. They built fountains, ice skating rinks, bowling areas, even billiards. So this all to get the community familiar with being inside. In a way, it trained them to become mall users. Ironically, this same mall that started providing or doing development or community development for the locals, like 30 years later, has gone high-end. So now it's more after a higher income demographic. So all the fountains, etc., have been thrown out, and there was a big protest from the local community that wanted the mall developer to put some of these facilities back in. Another problem of this type of a reform is that it's a very kind of monotonous experience. Because you're forced through the mall, there's this feeling of constantly walking through corridors, which very often the same type of storefronts. Like we counted the number of Zara's and the number of H&M's, and almost each of these have one of those. And this is a very monotonous experience. You can even avoid the street altogether because in some areas are owned by a very large developer that owns multiple malls, and they started connecting different blocks and different malls with these elevated walkways. So you can bypass the street altogether. And it's somewhat of a bewildering experience for those of you who go to Hong Kong. I remember the first time I was there, is that you get out of the subway and there's this whole maze of escalators that will take you through different mall corridors and atriums. But it's a very kind of commercial experience in which you're very often inside. But at the same time, it's also a very dynamic and exciting form of public space. And this is an image from the book that's from an article that Jonathan Solomon wrote, who authored or co-authored this book called Cities Without Ground. And they argued that Hong Kong is a city that doesn't have a single ground like New York City or any other city in the world. It has all these networks and different elevated bridges and atriums, and as a result it is a city that has many grounds, or maybe it's a city that has no ground at all. And perhaps we should be open-minded and we should think about that this kind of three-dimensional network also creates the possibility for new forms of public space and new chance encounters. And that's certainly the case when you go out onto these spaces on Sunday. So there's a very large population of domestic helpers in Hong Kong, and a lot of Filipinos, Indonesian maids. And Sunday is their mandatory day off. Because of the lack of public open space in Hong Kong, you do not have a lot of parks. And because they're not so much allowed to kind of picnic in the mall, you see them on these elevated walk bridges. And this is a walk bridge that's right next to the IFC, the International Finance Center. So this could create a new chance encounter, as Baudelaire once wrote about Paris, between a domestic helper and a finance director in Hong Kong. Still, during the umbrella movement, Hong Kong's 2014 protests for universal suffrage, students occupied neither the quasi-public spaces on top of malls, nor the interior atriums, but they occupied the very little that was left of Hong Kong's public space. They placed their tents smack on highways, right in front of the malls. Their recuperation of public urban space expressed the street's democratic importance. Good urban space and its capacity for inclusiveness, difference, spontaneity, as well as for contestation is vital to any city. Like the ancient Greek agoras were places to buy goods and to discuss politics, and became the birthplace of democracy. I think the challenge is to develop these podium-tower developments so that they can contribute to the public realm, and that it's not all internalized. And already some of these new projects are looking or are moving this direction. So for instance, City Walk is a mall that has a kind of active storefront. It also has its own courtyard with vertical green wall. And I think the street experience has something to offer retail as well. If you go to Hong Kong, probably the most vibrant place that's equally retail-centric as a mall is Lang Kwai Fong. It's just public space with a lot of shop fronts. So public space appears attractive to retail as well. And recent trends in China retail design certainly point to that direction. This is Sanlitun Village, designed by Oval Partnership in Beijing. And although it's a single developer and it's a single designer, it's actually designed as a village. So it's exploiting this streetscape experience and making that kind of central to this, what is essentially a mall. Meanwhile, the hyperdense Asian mall is coming to New York City as well. So with the new kind of Calatrava Oculus and Westfield World Trade Center just around the corner, a mall that's 2 to 6 stories. But also what's currently being built at Hudson Yards, the shops at Hudson Yards, which is going to be 7 levels and 1 million square feet, 3 times bigger than Westfield here. What we're seeing is perhaps a comeback of the mall, but in a very different form. In short, the mall isn't dead, it's just changing. And to get a sense of the future, take a look at Hong Kong. So as Carol was saying, this book fits in a series on Asian urbanism and urbanization, in case you're interested. And I've also written about consumerism more in this book on Las Vegas, which is coming out later this month. Thank you.
Question. Does the audience have any questions? Other questions?
I want to begin my question by commending you on being so honest about the pluses and the minuses of malls. But it might be fair to ask the question, how would you measure the success of a mall? And I ask that in part because so much of it is public, and yet the private part of it would suggest you'd be looking for a proper financial return.
Yeah.
And then Hong Kong is distorting unto itself.
Yeah.
So what would you say to that?
Yeah, so that's a good and a fair question. So I think this mall is like trade-offs, right? So a mall needs to be profitable for a developer, but you know, for it to be profitable, it needs to be attractive, right? And I think that is in a way a potential to sell more goods. It's a desirable place to go to. The case of Hong Kong is peculiar because the mall retail is developed by a public company. Perhaps the profit motive is not at the forefront as let's say like Westfield here in New York. So that is somewhat unique. Now, do I think that a mall is necessarily anti-urban? I think in the case of Hong Kong, there's also malls that have phenomenal atriums and spectacular spaces on the inside, and at the same time have the storefront. So I think it's also a design question. I think if you're a good designer, maybe you can also design a mall in such a way that it contributes to street life. Gary, yeah.
I was interested in that chart you had right at the front, which was on the, if I understood it, the amount of retail space per capita in different cities. And
Yeah.
Seems clear that Asia has much more retail space per capita than North America or even for that matter Europe. Europe's probably somewhere in between. And yet the average amount of disposable income they have in Hong Kong or in Asia per capita is a lot less than what we have here. Yeah. So how do you explain the amount of retail space that there is in Hong Kong? I mean, is it?
Yeah. Well, Hong Kong is somewhat of a unique case because it's right next to China, or I should say part of China. And Hong Kong has been, for decades, been kind of the Chinese preferred place to shop because it was a place where all brands could be found and they were not knockoffs, they were originals. So there's a lot of Chinese that go to Hong Kong to go shopping. However, now that's going to be in decline because a lot of mall space has been built in China over the past years. I think the city of Tianjin alone, in 1 year, produced more malls than I think Moscow and Paris combined in only a period of 1 year. So that's the risk, that there is indeed a lot in Hong Kong, but this was geared to a Chinese customer that perhaps won't go to Hong Kong. Now they can find the same brands at home.
So is there any tendency in Hong Kong or China itself that's similar to what we're seeing particularly here in the Midwest with shopping centers and strip malls just vacant?
Yeah.
Is that tendency, is there any indication of that developing there?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when I was there, we didn't see that, and I think there was actually new malls being built. Haisang Place was just opened, I think, last year or two years ago. It was another kind of like 15, 20-story mall. And I remember when I was there, for instance, in Dongguan, the Mall of China was built, which is at the time the world's largest mall. And we joked it was also the world's emptiest mall because it had an 80% vacancy rate. But now, actually, a couple of years later, that mall is no longer the emptiest because of the wealth that was created in China. So it effectively created a lot of kind of domestic consumption. So when we took this snapshot, it was not the case, but this might happen in the future.
You mentioned Victor Gruen and Corbusier. I was wondering if you would see another kind of historical precedent in the work of John Portman and his use of atriums and multiple levels and this sort of groundless interiority that Frederick Anderson famously.
Yeah, for sure. And John Portman and this kind of interiorized hotels and how I think John Jurdy fits in that tradition. I think that he also works on these commercial projects, but then makes them really exciting. But their projects are mainly to be experienced from the inside. So it's a game of how do you animate the atrium with the elevator going up and down, or with escalators going in and out, with moving balconies this way or the other way. So I think Jurdy definitely fits in that camp, and his work is very influential, particularly in Asia.
And Portman has a whole Asian initiative that he started almost, 20 years ago or more, to build in Shanghai. Some of his first international buildings were in Shanghai, and his son, who's taking over the firm, speaks Mandarin, studied Mandarin. Yeah. Spends a great deal of his time in China.
What was the first urban mall?
Anywhere?
Yeah.
Well, I think in the U.S., the first one was Midtown Plaza in Rochester, New York, which was an urban mall, but a mixed-use project as well. A hotel and an office building above the atrium space within it. And there were lots of examples of atriums in office buildings, other places in the U.S., but that was the first deliberately planned.
But in that context, I'm sorry, how would you characterize the Gallerias, Milan, or the first one up in Watertown, New York, or the one in Cleveland? I don't know if Philadelphia has anyone, but is that part of that lineage, or?
I think that's a whole other tradition, and some more flourished in Australia, in places where they have passageways going to railway stations, which had covers over them and multi-stories on them. That's a different kind of tradition, one that Gruen was particularly interested in and tried to make his malls mimic that.
Well, I think if you think of malls as urbanizing features, right, whether they're in cities or they're in suburbs, that goes back to a tradition of the high-rise, in fact, in Chicago most notably, where Masonic Temple, which was the tallest building in the city, had a nine-story shopping center around an open atrium back in 1892. So, and many Chicago buildings had multi-story shopping. And railroad ticket offices and all the other sorts of things. I mean, most often they were 2 or 3 stories, but Masonic Temple, I think, had 9 stories.
I'm taking notes because I'm writing a piece for The Guardian on this. So thank
Okay.
you.
I'll tell you some more later.
Hillary.
I have a question about the public space that you showed us, which seems so inadequate. First of all, is it the MTRC that has to approve the design for the public space, or is there another municipal authority that has oversight over that?
It's the planning department, which is another governmental body. Yeah.
Oh, so why do they accept this, you know, putting it on the top floor in the most inaccessible place with such poor design?
So Hong Kong is very pro-development, and it's completely laissez-faire. I always like to contrast Hong Kong with Singapore, because they're both similar-sized places and both former kind of city-states and similar populations, but completely different planning methodologies. So Hong Kong is very developer-oriented, laissez-faire, and you go to Hong Kong, it's very vibrant, but also messy, right? And it's rough. Singapore, on the other hand, is completely top-down, controlled, and it works well. It's well planned, it's efficient. It's also sterile, right? So some people talk about Disneyland with the death penalty, right? So that's it's because of the nature of governance. It's just
but in defense of Singapore, where we had an exhibition of Wohai just last summer, 90% of the people live in public housing, so government-built housing, and 82% of those people own their own homes.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Kind of following on the public space question, you have a reference between the per capita and like size space allocation for shopping centers. Do you also have some sort of correlation between the relative size of residential space and the kind of the much smaller scale that's allowed on Hong Kong Island especially, and how that might be the lack of public space and how most
people's homes are really small. I remember when I was living in a shoebox-sized apartment, right? And then when you go into this grandiose mall and atrium, it becomes a preferred place to meet because you simply have space. Now, what's really interesting about Hong Kong is that there's some of this myth that says that Hong Kong is a dense place because it's constrained by hillsides and there's not a lot of place to build on. That in fact is not true. There's a lot of pieces of the city that are actually perfectly developable. So for instance, if you go to Shenzhen, right near the border with Hong Kong, there's an entire CBD and a lot of skyscrapers. Now what the government is doing is that it's artificially constricting the supply of land to keep the values up. Because I think about 60% of the government's revenue is derived from land leasing. So there is open space,
That is a lot.
but it's just not in it's just not in the city. So there is this link.
Have you given any thought to the current correlation between e-shopping and the effect it's had? And we all seem to think there's an effect there. And the fact that going back in time, when television came out, the movie theaters were going to be out of business, and yet that hasn't happened. So there's a relationship perhaps between the social element of shopping and shopping malls in the same way?
Absolutely. So when I talk to mall developers, what they think is happening is that, or what they're doing, they're increasing the percentage of food and beverage. because these are in these malls, because these are kind of unique experiences when you go to a restaurant that you cannot get online, right? And so when you look at a lot of these new China malls that are being built, there's a lot of restaurants, and people like to go there, and also looking at other people and this whole social aspect that they're playing out. I think this is also maybe explaining why a lot of the new malls are actually more kind of streetscapes, because that is, again, an experience that can be desirable for shoppers, right? And it's very different from kind of the more sterile shopping experience as they existed in the early malls.
I mean, I completely agree with all the things that you're saying, and while you did mention it, I would just underscore for people who haven't visited Hong Kong or anywhere in the south of China or Singapore, that it's air conditioning that is the reason for these malls, right? It's the modernization of life and being cool when when it's 88 degrees and 80% humidity every single day.
So my question is kind of related to the previous one. One of the things that stood out, I think, in your talk was that this mall design has, on the one hand, kind of people tap into natural human tendencies and create this very organic experience, but also has a way of dictating how people consume. I'm wondering, as you have, changing demographic, changing consumption patterns, e-commerce, etc., how are the mall developers and actually owners and managers of these malls thinking about responding to that, given that a mall, once it's built and it's occupied, is a very static thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think also organizing events, you see more and more how in malls, including some of the Westfield malls, for instance, in London, like they would organize fashion shows for people to get into. I think individual retailers are being really smart as well. So they have online and offline components, like Apple's really good with this, right? So there's an online experience, but you still want to go there to the shop, this minimalist design, and talk to a genius whenever your iPhone is or a company like Nike, right, in which you can customize your shoes online, and then you can actually go to the store and pick them up and have this different interface with a person. So I think there's ways in which the offline is connected to the online, and that this is part of the experience, the brand experience. And actually a lot of retailers and but also like other companies, like office buildings, there's more and more attention to design, because they realize that that an effective brand is also one that has a physical presence, a storefront that has a unique experience that can connect with people. All of this is part of the brand identity. So you can explain, for instance, the whole phenomenon of all these kind of really famous architects like Rem Koolhaas and Herzog and Moran collaborating with Prada, for instance, on Prada flagship stores. It's all part of this larger trend of branding.
Do you notice like either stratifications of shops where perhaps there's cheaper retail at the bottom versus higher, or perhaps I was thinking, I don't know how it could be designed, but issues of equity in terms of like escalators, for example, like certain escalators lead to certain lifestyle shopping or certain like identity being intertwined within the mall design.
What's interesting is that so we tend to think about malls, it's just like big retailers and the small, how can the small guy survive, right? But there's some malls, they have these boxes that you can rent as if you want to sell individually. So there's these stores that you can rent a little box with a window. You can put your own goods in there. All you need to do is you pay a small fee to the shop owner, and people can still kind of shop around and buy your individual product. So you can have your own miniature storefront at a massive discount.
It's like an automat for.
Yeah, a bit like that, a bit like that. But there's actual shop owner who will be there and manage the whole shop. So there's this phenomenon that exists in Hong Kong, but I haven't seen it anywhere else, just in Hong
Oh,
Kong.
but also in Kowloon and Mongkok, there are lower class, they're kind of like multi-story bazaars because they're little booths and they're all next to each other and organized by same, same goods.
And what's interesting is that if you go to Kowloon and Mongkok, those areas, each of them specializes in their own type of product. The agglomeration effect, right? So we see how some focus on pirated DVDs. Maybe no longer because you can watch them online, but there's others focus on computer components. There's one, Chungking Mansions, which is really super interesting building. Gordon Matthews, he wrote a chapter in the book. He calls it perhaps the most globalized building in the world because it has more than 100 nationalities. This building is known to be sort of the entry point for African migrants into Hong Kong, and so what people sell there is precisely the things you need when you just move to Hong Kong, like cell phones and cheap phone cars to call to other places. There's also ones that cater to, let's say, the Filipino domestic helpers. So they provide Filipino food as well as remittance services. So they can wire money back to their families. So you do see that kind of specialization across different income demographics. Yeah.
I got a question related to finance. We started from the best of the mall in the United States, most of them concerning the suburban malls. So, for nowadays, I think the city malls are not so good as well. For the malls in Shanghai, as an instance, quite many are suffering from the efficiency of the shopping activities, and they were mostly replaced by restaurant and also as kind of showroom, because people just go inside to take pictures and go online shopping in later times. So quite many malls are facing problems nowadays. So that means that more could not exist anymore in nowadays, and they could not exist or survive itself alone. It could be combined with kind of big or mega project for promoting those spaces above as a office or residential areas.
So this is certainly true in Shanghai. You go to Weihai Lu, and it's all Hong Kong developers that are building there. Like K11, building this massive 25-story mixed-use development that's really centered around the mall, right? So these are Hong Kong developers that are building these very dense mixed-use type of projects in Shanghai, but in which the mall is very central. So what's interesting about China is that within such a short period, the mall has gone through so many kind of iterations, right? There were like the Wanda, right, already talks about like the Mall 6.0, Mall 7.0. It's already evolved so fast. So I think for us to get a sense of the future, I think we really need to look at Hong Kong and China, where it's growing so fast because of this rapid growth of consumer society.
But there's also the irony, and Gary probably has an opinion on this as well. So since you've written so much about southern China, and I was recently in Guangzhou and Shenzhen, the irony of all of this in the malls is that it's really an abdication of city planning to deal with the street and the street life. While we're in Guangzhou, the weather was terribly hot, it was raining, it was humid in 80 or 90 degrees. And we made our way between, it wasn't in Guangzhou, it was in Shenzhen, between two hotels through a mall, through an MTR station, into
Yeah.
another mall, into the
Yeah.
conference hotel, a mile
Yeah.
away, literally a mile away, all
Yeah.
through a climatized space that was,
Yeah.
protected. But it's not that we wouldn't have wanted to have been on the street as an option, but the street was so inimical to
Yeah.
pedestrian life, in addition to being hot and steamy and full of traffic, that it had no activity on the street.
Yeah.
So is that an abdication by the government, by
Yeah.
planners, to dealing with improving the quality of the pedestrian experience, or anything
Yeah.
about city planning?
Well, I think I should defer to Gary here, because he's been going to China much longer than I have. But what's one of the problems with Chinese cities is that mixed use was actually really tough. Like regulations kind of were more geared towards mono-use type of districts. So you have just pure residential and you have just pure commercial. And I think now they're trying to relax that, but and also in terms of like planning for pedestrians, all of this was not really considered, right? It was just kind of get the super blocks out, the large infrastructure, with very little attention to, how do people cross the street, or what makes an interesting street with a nice active storefront. Like all these thoughts were somewhat skipped over. And as a consequence, if you want to go to the more exciting urban places, you have to go to these commercial developments. For instance, Beijing, which is really a city with these very massive super blocks that are very car-centric. The more interesting areas is like Sanlitun, where you can actually, walk around and be a pedestrian and have exciting urban spaces. Or just across the street is a Soho project that you can also walk through. So yeah, that's right. But now they're catching on. So there's going to be a nationwide urban design guideline reform, and Young Gil who is the urban designer that's really focusing on the pedestrian experience. Is redesigned parts of Puxi in Shanghai, the whole new pedestrian plan that is being put forward.
So this seems like a good opportunity to have a drink and maybe ask a question individually, and hopefully buy a book, which you can get here and take to the cash register in the front, and to thank Stefan for a wonderful